Hello, it's David Greenwood here, partner at Odgers Berndtson. I'm doing the second part of a two-part series with David Fairhurst. And as a recap, David was the former Global Chief People Officer for McDonald's Corporation. As some of you will know, McDonald's has over 2 million employees and 120 markets. Prior to that, he was also the Corporate HR Director for Tesco PLC. Welcome back, David.
Thank you very much, David. Pleased to be here.
Now, before we kick off a round of questions that, again, I'm sure after the first part will be very relevant to what's happening now. I understand that you've also been rather busy while looking for a new global role. You set up your own consultancy. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I set up a company called Org Shakers Limited, gathered together a group of people in the sort of people space, people insights, communications, people who've worked with me actually, so I know them all personally over the last number of years from different companies. And what's really been fun is really starting to spark some ideas about the workplace and the future of work, etc. So yeah, it's been a really good time to get my thoughts together as to what we're going to see in organizations.
Well, I wish you well with that consultancy while you look for a new role, and hopefully I can be the one that supports you further with that. Now, the prediction that we talked about in the first part on the workforce crisis or cliff, predictions are something that I wanted to touch on today. Now that you've had time to reflect, what would be your predictions for perhaps the next 10 years or less?
Yeah, you know, in the last webinar that we had, we talked about back in 2014 this whole notion of where I declared in the Financial Times that there was going to be a potential workforce cliff, where the supply of labour was going to be short based on relatively the demand of labour throughout industry in all sectors in the coming years, and we saw that to become true. At the end, I also talked about how, to a degree, this shortage of labour around the world would now be put back about 3 to 5 years as a result of COVID-19. But here is one prediction that is something that really is concerning for me right now, and that is organisations will risk falling into a trap of what I call remarginalisation. Remarginalisation. If they fail to respond decisively to some of the progress they've made, particularly around some underrepresentative groups of employees in the workplace. As I say, the 2014 predictions came to fruition. We saw it in Germany first and Holland, and more recently in the UK, and about to sort of getting there in the US, where basically we were finding it difficult and so to employ people. And so employers were really getting better at thinking about how do we get older people working in the organization? How do we get the long-term unemployed organization? But here's the issue and the prediction. If companies pull the plug on all the great work that they've done in the last 5 years, if they ease off on some of the progress that they're making, then we're going to see a big issue. Now, what my research is showing is that already we're starting to see evidence of a withdrawal of investment in certain pockets of the workplace. Particularly, I've been talking to Stephen Frost, who's an expert in diversity and inclusion based in the UK. He's done some research that shows around 50% of organizations that he's seen have already pulled the plug on their diversity and inclusion work. We're already seeing them in the media, countries around the world stopping their apprenticeship schemes, their entry-level schemes, the schemes for long-term unemployed youth and getting them back into work. These things are starting to stop. We're also seeing some information from the very reputable International Labour Organization, the ILO, that says there are certain pockets of the workforce that are going to be affected. So young people, they predict that young people are going to be affected, potentially a whole lost generation of graduates who are going to be leaving university around now and not be able to get employed. And we've seen the impact of that back in 2014. Older workers, we're already starting to see discrimination against those who are over 50. And I'm one of them, by the way, because employers are worried about employing older people post-pandemic. What happens if they don't survive? I mean, we're starting to see an impact in the labour market. Women are heavily employed in sectors that are going to get heavily affected by this pandemic, the service sectors, for example, retail. And so therefore they could be disproportionately impact. And then finally, for obvious reasons, migrant workers, for geopolitical reasons, immigration reasons, and so on. We're already starting to see an impact and an attitude towards migrant labourers. And I can only speak here, for example, in the US. So the message to clients for me is please, please, please continue to invest in all of the people practices that you were investing in. D&I, diversity and inclusion, continues to be a core strategic thing for your organization to make sure that all of these groups of people continue to be attracted to your organization and that you continue to invest in your employer brand and your employee experience, because we're going to end up in the workforce cliff again in 3 years' time. So now's not the time to switch off all of these things that help people, these groups of people that I've talked to, back into work. Let's try and avoid this remarginalization. Let's avoid discrimination going back 10 years, and that could happen if we're not careful.
And I think they're very valuable points, David. Certainly in the Middle East, as you know, there is a number of different employees that are really pushing that employer of choice mechanism. But then we've also got the Saudization, Emiratization, and all the other GCC countries that are looking to, certainly in Saudi Arabia, a number of people will study outside of the kingdom and return and obviously need to fulfill a career. So I think all of those things will also have a knock-on effect in the Middle East. But I know there's a number of organizations and a number of HR practitioners out there that are really making some real change out there. One question that's going to be asked a lot is, and dare I say, normality. There will be a new norm. I think there is a new norm now. Generally speaking, what do you think the workplace, or what sort of things that we will notice in the workplace when we do resume normality, whether it be shaking of hands or not, to the more policies and processes, I guess?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one, and one that I have a strong view on right now. I saw an email yesterday, very similar to what you just said, the long journey back to normality. And I think there's a real danger in considering an attitude towards normality, because it won't be normal and there won't be a normality. You could say it's a new norm, but I don't think that's going to happen. We have had a massive impact by this pandemic around the world in people working from home. Let's just take a step back for a minute and think about other examples of where people haven't been in work and the impact on them. So for those of you who've ever had a career break, the lead up to that career break, what you felt like during that career break, and what it felt like coming back to work after that career break, or a maternity, and maybe an extended maternity, or even going back to school, to a school reunion. Can you remember what it was like walking back into that room? There is a degree of vulnerability. McDonald's years ago created the notion, I think, of corporate sabbaticals. This is where after 10 years you get time, paid time off to go and do all sorts of things. And many people value it, and it's a wonderful benefit. But I've also seen the impact on people leading up to the sabbaticals and the pressure they put on themselves. I've seen people worrying whilst on sabbatical about how they stay connected and feeling disconnected and what's their purpose. And I've seen people coming back from sabbaticals and the impact on them as well. You take other organizations where there's been an attempt to take people out of the workplace. If you look at HSBC, HSBC wanted to have people have a break. They saw the value of having a break from work, and they know how difficult it is to get people to have a break from work. So they created a concept called core hours. And every year you had to define your two-week core hours. And during that time, you were not allowed by policy to go on your email or on your work phone, or you'd be disciplined. Literally switched off, I think. I don't know if that literally switched it off, but that's how hard it is to get people to have this break, whether it's good for them or not. Back in 2008, Goldman Sachs were very innovative. They looked at women who were coming back, having been out of the workplace for like 15 years, bringing up children, whatever, and how hard it is to come back into the workplace. And they called something called returnships. And it was a play on internships and the support you could give to women to get them back into the workplace. And that was taken on by companies like Sarah Lee and others and evolved. And it was a great thing. Now, I know that sitting at home like we are now is that we're meant to be working, but it's not work as we know it, right? We're educators and we're teachers of our kids right now. We're looking after elderly parents and worrying about them. We're trying to be in isolation. All of this, that's not normal work. And what we're going through is not normal. So what's actually happening is that our brain, and I'm working with a psychologist on this called Dr. Dan Cable, Professor Dan Cable from London Business School. He's done work on this before. Our brain is being shaken, and we are in a state of vulnerability. I'll give you an example. On the 23rd of March, Harvard Business Review published a piece called "The Discomfort That You Are Feeling is Grief." And the article itself, which you can see on the 23rd of March, is not particularly interesting or in depth. It's about the grief cycle of shock, and anger and all of the things that you go through in a psychological circle of emotions. But it was downloaded more than any other article ever, I think. And why? Because it was speaking to us about what is it we're feeling. So we're vulnerable. So here's the interesting thing for employers. If you think your workforce is coming back and that you as a manager are almost thinking, aren't we clever? We've kept this business going. You're probably thankful you've got your job. You're probably going to drop that little pay increase that you've been going on about before this pandemic because I, the employer, feel I'm in a good place. You're totally wrong. Because people are coming back and they are looking to be hurt or helped. And their expression of their psychology will be accentuated. So if you hurt them, it's going to feel like a molehill to a mountain. And if you do something good, it's going to feel like a molehill to a mountain. So employers really need to think about returnment. That's the thing, how I've called it, the returnment of the workforce. This is not bringing back people and asking them to thank you for keeping their jobs. This is a very, very interesting leadership challenge. So my suggestion is that on day one, week one, and month one, you've got to think about three things in terms of your employees returning and the state of that return. On day one, think about re-onboarding. Think about the effort that you put into recruiting somebody in the first place. That's the effort that you now need to put into them. So on the re-onboarding, there's a welcome back. There's a congratulations. There's recognition for those who did outstanding work during a pandemic, and so on and so forth. Day one, re-onboarding strategy. Week one, a re-engaging strategy. Stuff's happened during this pandemic. Managers have changed the way they're working. Employees have changed the way they're responding. What's actually happened? What was good? What was not good? What's different? What were the learnings? So, and it's not just about Zoom. It's way deeper than just remote working. Things have changed. So let's think about re-engaging. Month one, re-recruiting, and particularly re-recruiting your best people. And I would suggest that doing things like stay interviews, for example, where rather than exit interviews. What is it you need to do your job? Have you got everything? How are you doing? Are there issues at home? Financial well-being, etc., etc., etc. Have a dialogue, even talking about compensation and how much we pay you. I don't know. But the reality is you've got to think about a staged returnment process. All sorts of interesting things are going to happen with talent. And if you don't get your act together as leaders and as an HR profession on this sort of returnment strategy, then you're likely to see huge turnover. And guess what? Some of your best people, it will not be a point of stability. You're going to have to make sure that you're engaging people in critical roles in the way that you first recruited them. And there is going to be a temptation in the eyes of the line managers to really try and normalize this and get back to normal. It is not a normal. So there are some other things that I'd share with you, that it's not a new normal because it's a new work order. Some things are going to be different. And let me give you some examples. Firstly, well-being. We've talked about this before. Well-being is going to shoot right up the agenda of consideration. And even in the last chat that we had, David, I talked about maybe there needs to be a well-being officer in an organization. Because for the next 2 years, certainly the British government are talking about how you're going to have to change the work practices and social distancing for the next 2 years. Who's going to do that? Who's going to look at the returnment, the testing, the antibody testing, the ergonomics of an office? Who's in charge of that? And that needs a concerted effort. And I think there's somebody who can focus on that. The second thing is something called job crafting. And I'm really interested in this notion of job crafting. And this is post-industrial revolution. The way we made sense of our jobs is that we categorized them with a job description, and then we evaluated them with a hay system, and then we had pay bands, and then we almost to the point where if you go outside of your job description, you'd almost get punished because you're designed that the job description defines who you are. Well, let me tell you, I think that's going to change. I think there's going to be a revolution. I think people are going to want to personalize their jobs. And I'm not just talking Zoom and remote working. I'm talking people bringing themselves to their jobs, job crafting, changing the nature of their tasks and their roles, challenging some of the things they did before, doing some new things, changing some of the relationships, the way the manager works and they work with the manager. So I think the whole notion of job crafting at all levels and at all ages is something that is going to be a real phenomenon. And then the next two things I would say is that there's going to be a massive focus on careers. People are going to be coming back, not saying, thank you, I've still got a job. No. They're going to be coming back saying, what's the purpose of my job? Can I personalize it? Where's my career going? By the way, I've never liked you as a manager. I'm thinking I don't want to work for you anymore. Or I think you're great and I want to continue. Where's my career? So career chats are going to go up, not down. And that also, we're going to see a massive surge in training and education. The universities in America are predicting a 30% surge in registrations. Why? Because people are seeking meaning, particularly after their brain has been shocked. They are seeking. So the returnment is going to have all these interesting things. It's not the things that I fear some line managers are thinking in terms of this back to normalization. So what it means for leaders is you're going to have to get personal and you're going to have to get focused on people. You're going to have to charm your people. Do you know what charm stands for? You need to be committed to help, attract, retain, and motivate your people. And that's going to be a key leadership challenge in as the workforce comes back in.
I think there's a couple of comments from me on that. Is number one, I think particularly in the US, the carving of roles, certain individuals that have a talent that may not be in that job categorization profile, but the leaders are considering them to carve a role for them, extra responsibility or a different role, like a chief wellbeing officer, perhaps, is one point. And I think the other thing, certainly during the working from home and the pandemic, is that there's certain individuals that have really stepped up in their role and gone above and beyond their day-to-day role, whatever that might be, whatever level that is. And I think those people need to be recognized when they come back to the workforce and celebrated and even promoted. Because I think certain people and all of us around here have had to adjust ourselves mentally and within our working conditions. And I think people have really stepped up. They need to be recognized. And then on the opposite side, there's people that have perhaps not stepped up, which is a surprise. So I think you're absolutely right that the leaders out there will really need to do some real thinking before that comes back to the office. One final point, I'm just conscious of your time, David. If you were in my shoes as a headhunter, hiring senior executives and board, what would be the, I guess, 5 traits or leadership traits that both an employer, my clients, and I as a headhunter would be looking for now, do you think?
It's a great question because, as we have been through this incredible test of leadership, we need to think about where we're investing, where we're focusing, where we're refocusing, and where we need the help of people like you, David, at Odgers to make sure that we're hiring right people to make us future fit. The first thing, and there's a few that spring to mind, the first is that these are incredibly difficult times and leaders are having to reconcile some pretty irreconcilable dilemmas and test, it's really testing them. So the first skill I would say is that we're going to need people who have really an always-on approach to transformation. So I don't know whether that's attitudinal or a skill, but change is happening and it's happening quicker and quicker, and the answers are no longer right and wrong, and it's people who can really bring these things together to get the best answer, not necessarily the right answer for organizations. So I think that's the first skill, people who can reconcile seemingly irreconcilable dilemmas. The second thing is getting the right strategy now and for the future in an organization is important, but it's not the hardest part. If you get some good brains together, any organization can get the right strategy. Many organizations have got the right strategy over time, but not all succeed. And the reason that they don't succeed is because it's about the hardest part is actually getting people behind the strategy. And as organizations strategically need to pivot at the moment in time, the biggest challenge is how to take the people with you. And the biggest challenge is not usually the senior leadership or even the front-facing, customer-facing people at the front end, it's usually what I call the middle earth. It's the middle earth of an organization that if you as a leader can help inspire and move them, then you can move the whole system with you. So the second thing I would say is the ability to move a middle earth in an organization to get them with you. And there's going to be a lot of change. The third thing I would say is leadership, as I say, is about getting the best answer. It's no longer about getting the right answer. And the focus that I would put on your candidates is something that I would call and leadership, A-N-D, and leadership. What do I mean by that? You know, this has been presented in different guises over the last few years about ambidextrous leadership and various things, but and leadership is very simple for me. You need somebody who can manage today and the future. And that's being really tested right now, from people who are just dealing with the short-term weekly stuff to people who are keeping the strategic ship in the right, you know, in the right direction. So you need people who can do both today and the future. You need people who can do the market and the enterprise. You know, it's not just about managing your own department or country. It's somebody who can do across as well as vertical. That's the second hand. The third hand, who can do execution and innovation. It's no use being somebody who can just make stuff happen or somebody who comes up with ideas. We need leaders who can do both and can swivel between both. And we need people who can do what I would call merit, i.e. doing good things and attention. So it's no use doing good things if your customers don't notice, or your employees. So you've got to have, so this and leadership, the ability to be able to maneuver between the two, I'd say is the third thing. Now, the final thing I would say is, you know, I've talked a lot about well-being. I've talked a lot about the concerns of employees. I've talked about well-being going up the topic. Let me tell you what the key to well-being is relative to your work, David, and that is post-COVID-19, the number one thing that will help well-being is actually having a culture that is actually helpful and caring, a culture that is supportive, a culture that asks the right questions, that provides the right solutions when you're in need. That's the sort of thing. And the key to that culture is line managers with EQ. Simple as that. You know, you can look at a lot of band-aids around well-being, a lot of things you could do around flexible working or this or that. They're all tactics. It's a cultural thing. Do your line managers actually have the emotional intelligence to ask the right questions and show the right care? So those are the things, in summary, I would say. Those who can be always on transformation, those who basically can be and leaders, they can do one thing or another, those people who've got the EQ, and those who can move middle earth in a culture as you go about all of this change. So those are the things that I would particularly ask you and your colleagues to help us focus on as we bring and develop leaders within or from outside the organization.
And I think in simple terms, it's going to be a very quick question around some of the examples that the leaders did put in place for the pandemic and how they describe and demonstrate some of those areas will be quite telling with different leaders from different markets, particularly in the Middle East. So that's going to be a very simple question to ask, and some of those examples are going to be very much analysed by us in terms of what good looks like. David, thank you very much for spending the time in your morning and my afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope the audience do take a number of things away from this, but beyond anything, we remain together, and I want to thank you very much and stay safe. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you, everybody. Good luck.